Hi and welcome to School Shorts with me, Melissa Chan Green, a journalist and mum of two with an interest in education. I wanted this episode to be all of the best nuggets of info from a year's worth of podcasts, or perhaps some of the most talked about clips of the year, just all in one place for anyone who hasn't been able to catch it all, which I'm sure with busy family life will surely be the norm rather than the exception. And there have been themes throughout some of the chats that we have had on School Shorts that I thought were actually just useful to pick out and highlight as well. But we'll get to that soon. I just wanted to also take this opportunity to thank you, all of you who have tuned in this year, whether it has been a few episodes or loads. If you have found anything useful, can I please ask a favour and ask that you give it a review on whatever podcast site that you listen to, tick the follow button, or if you watch on YouTube, if you would subscribe there and send me some feedback. That would be so helpful. It helps me to push it out wider for discoverability, and also just helps me to know what you want to hear about, what I should keep doing, what topics are most likely to resonate. The topic I'm going to start with today, though, is literacy. Because there is something that is really important and I think potentially concerning as a challenge for families that we're not hearing that much about. And I say this after a year of speaking with educators right across the sector and different topics and areas, experts here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also across the world, and people who are directly involved in all of the change that is going on in the way our kids read, write, spell, and learn. And what we are seeing mostly reported in the public arena is the difference of opinion between those who love these science-backed changes and say that this is the best thing for our children, and those who say that it doesn't align with what they believe good learning looks like. That is always going to be an important discussion to have, because we need decision makers to be always accountable for big changes, especially when they are happening so fast and when they impact so many people. But another really important discussion to have, which I don't think has been covered as much, is about the wide spectrum in educators' knowledge about what structured literacy is and what good looks like. So how to do that well in a classroom so that it is most effective for our children. And I think there are many reasons for that, what I call a spectrum of knowledge. Some of the reasons are, all of this has been pushed through so fast. That's just one reason. Schools can't just release a whole lot of teachers to go and learn about it, because they've got the day-to-day of the classroom stuff to do as well. And I think there's also a lot of misunderstandings about what it is too. One of them perhaps is that structured literacy is just about teaching kids to sound out words using phonics. Now, schools are being told that they're not expected to get it perfect, which is a totally reasonable thing to say. But for parents, it means that some schools may be doing this really well, and they may have been doing it for a while, and the educators may feel confident and experienced, and they may be feeling like they're really on a flow. And others will be at the beginning of their journey and won't have had the same access to resource to make it happen, or are just not as confident with it. And there is absolutely no judgment on the people that are carrying this out or the schools that are carrying this out whatsoever. Because everyone has to start somewhere, and there's a difference in availability of support as well. But as parents, from a parent's perspective, you want your kids to go where it's all going pretty smoothly. And so the changes that are meant to mean that schools are teaching reading in pretty much the same way, so consistently across schools, so that if you send your child down the road to this school, then the quality of education that they're going to get, their achievement in reading, will be the same as if you sent your child down the school in the other direction to the other school. But actually, while all this change is going on, there still is a bit of a postcode lottery from my observation, and it will inevitably exist for some time while schools get up to speed with what is happening and the changes that are happening. So my observation, having seen that, is that it is now more important than ever that families are armed with a bit of information about what is happening in case your child is at a school where it's taking a little bit longer to get up to grips with it. So if you do want some more information and to know how to identify whether there's any issues for your child, where to start, the beginning is probably a good place. If you didn't catch the first episode of School Shorts, it was kind of setting out a pretty general overview of what structured literacy is and what the changes are. And that was with two women who are involved in setting teaching resources in some schools. They are Carla McNeil and Liz Kane. And they talked about this being quite an emotional journey for them and for many teachers. Here's a snippet.
My personal reason, one of them, is that my own son found learning to read incredibly difficult. As his mum, I didn't really know how to help him. I thought I did. I was a school teacher, then became a principal. And as a principal, I really learnt that actually I myself didn't really know how to help those children in a way that would lead to sustained progress in literacy. So that really is my why as to, why we really need to look at this deeply and consider how we are teaching our children to read in an evidence-based way.
Now that you know what you know, how is that emotionally? I imagine that's quite a hard thing to grapple with.
Yeah, and even you asking that, I get, a little bit welled up. It doesn't ever get easier. He's 22 now and he can read, but spelling is a real challenge for him. So it is incredibly difficult, but one day I'm going to have Grandy's Mel and I'm 100% going to know how to help them. And I look forward to that day.
Yeah, and they'll be very lucky Grandies too. Liz, do you have a personal reason?
Yeah, probably got a couple. One is back in the classroom. Myself, like Carla, when you're teaching, I can now reflect on the numerous children that were in my class that I actually have grieved for because I didn't know what I know now. I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the resources, didn't know the how to reach and teach all of the children in front of me. I did well with some kids, but not well enough with others. The other one is the job I was doing before this was called a resource teacher of literacy. And I was in 14 schools. And in every classroom in each of those schools, there were children struggling. And I realised that we were missing something really important. And so once we found out more, it's like, let's just get on and do this for the teachers so that they can do this for our children.
So what were they missing? Well, they go into this in way more detail in that episode, but just a couple of examples of the things they spoke about were the way teachers are teaching. It's called explicit teaching. And part of that means being really interactive, using strategies to make sure that the whole class is engaged in learning. I don't know if you're one of those students who may have tuned into parts of the lesson and then being kind of distracted by other things going on in the classroom at other times, or whether you were the person up the front putting your hand up all the time. But this explicit teaching is meant to even out that experience by having the whole class engaged at the same time. Another example of some of the changes, and perhaps one of the most commonly known, is instead of relying on pictures in books to assist with reading and using guessing techniques, it is a focus on reading the sounds and words. So that first episode is a really useful one for more detail on that. But if you want to know from a practical experience, from a practical standpoint as a parent, how to actually help with the skill of reading sounds and words, the rhythm of spelling rules and words, and what's known as phonological awareness. Then another episode 23, which was with teachers Sam Ellis and Jude Tabito, It's called The Essential Guide to Teach Reading, and it goes into a little bit deeper into more of the practical strategies to do this. They talk about things like what decodable books are, what heart words are. Those are terms that your child might have come home with and you might have thought, what is this? Because this is not something I remember when I was being taught to read. So they kind of cut through some of that jargon. As parents, we're not expected to be teachers, though. I think that's important to note. The teachers really are the experts in terms of that specific scope and sequence to teach it in. So in other words, there is an order in which reading is being taught. And so having a child master each level before they move on to a new level is making sure that students understand each skill before moving on, because you don't want a situation where they have looked like they've understood something or they have skipped understanding of something, because once you get on to those higher levels, it becomes harder and harder because you actually didn't master the basics. So it means fewer students falling through those gaps. I guess like the foundations of a house, and, you get it right at the bottom, and then what comes on top of that is much more stable. But if you rush through building a house, rush through the foundations, and you miss a pole or whatever, I'm not really a builder, so I don't know why I use this analogy. But then your building is going to get a whole lot more wobbly as you go up, obviously. There are things we can do to help at home, and here is a little of what Sam and Jude shared. Jude, can you explain, what authentic texts are and the purpose of them as well?
So, for instance, the authentic types of texts that children will be bringing home when they're starting to transition from decodable to texts that are not constrained by certain sounds, so they'll get a mixture. They're just really important to introduce new vocab, different types of genre. So you've got your non-fiction and fiction texts. Just getting children into the real, beautiful kind of books with really wonderful language, enriching their vocab, just so that they can be exposed to what they'll find out in the real world, library books. I mean, these books here, these are what we call rich texts, carefully selected books by the teacher to share to the children, pulling out the wonderful vocabulary. It introduces really cool sentence structures, literary devices. So because our children will be reading decodable books in the early years, the language won't be as rich, but we're still wanting them to expose them to this, so that we can talk about, comprehension in a lot more detail. And it's also great for children who struggle with reading to still be exposed to beautiful language books.
Because, for example, just looking at one of the ready-to-read phonics decodable books, it's saying, tap the map, I am not at the top, to the top. And so you're saying, these books are really great because they've learnt those spelling patterns, and that's going to give them the confidence of feeling like a reader. But that actually you need to listen to the book that you held up, Joe and the Stars, to hear those kind of quite rich, vocab-heavy sentences as well, in terms of extending their reading ability.
And the non-fiction books for teaching across the curriculum too is really, really important.
So teaching things about animals and science.
Real knowledge building, isn't it? Because it kind of then links in with their reading and their writing. Because what most schools are doing now is you've got your shared class text, which you kind of run with throughout the week, and it's normally aimed slightly higher than ability-wise, and you're kind of rereading that as a class, and you're pulling out, as you say, those really rich vocabulary words, and you're building that knowledge. And it also gives those children who possibly are on the scope and sequence but further back than some of their peers, it gives them that opportunity to be exposed to more.
You may have heard that statistic too, that young children whose parents read them 5 books a day start school having heard 1.4 million more words than kids whose parents never read to them. So by reading and listening to these books, if they are being read to, then it helps too with the knowledge of the world around them. And that knowledge helps scaffold working memory. because you're not having to learn a whole lot of new things at once. And that's really important with reading, but I'll talk a bit more about that soon. This idea of background knowledge is crucial for comprehension. So understanding what you are reading. Reading a word is one thing, but being able to connect the sound of that word to meaning is obviously actually the whole point. No point knowing how to make a sound if you don't know what that sound actually means. So this is where you might hear something called a knowledge-rich curriculum. It is, put quite simply, meaning having knowledge about a broad spectrum of subjects across literacy, art, science, history, and feeding that knowledge and building on it year on year. So going back to that scope and sequence again that I mentioned earlier. But also linking skills across each topic. So, for example, you might be learning spelling words in literacy and vocabulary in literacy, but you are also just as much doing that in science and maths as well. And then you're kind of connecting skills across topics as well. That's all curriculum stuff. So you might be thinking, okay, but what about families? Where do we come into this? And it's really simple and easy. So it is just about talking to kids about a wide range of topics and experiences. This is something that has been so common in the podcasts in the discussions that we've had this year on School Shorts. And those experiences don't have to be things that you need to pay for, although you can see how privilege comes in here, right? Because some kids naturally have a much wider range of experiences than others from birth. And so you do get an equity gap. And so to close that equity gap, understanding about how families can support kids with background knowledge through oral language and through reading to them is so key in bringing that equity gap, closing it basically. Here's Jude Tabito touching on that subject.
And it's okay to correct. And in fact, doing it respectfully, correcting is the right thing to do rather than letting mispronunciation of a sound continue or formation of a letter. And that serve and volley conversation, because in today's age, we're very time poor. So a lot of the conversations that might happen at home, and I'm guilty of that through my parenting at times, you just get receiving one word answers and that doesn't help children to develop that.
Yeah. Extending their knowledge and their vocabulary. So again, that is Sam Ellis and Jude Tabito in episode 23, if you want to hear more about that. Now, I mentioned earlier about working memory, and I've spoken with a few guests about that. But one of the guests that is really useful to listen to if you want to try and remember things, and not just for your children, but even as adults, is Nathaniel Swain. He talks about retrieval practice and spaced learning, and that is because of something called the forgetting curve. And simply, that means that we can forget up to 70% of what we have learned the very next day. 70% within 24 hours just goes out of the brain. That doesn't feel surprising to me. I think that happens with me a lot. But we can also forget up to 90% within a week if we don't try and do something to reinforce it, something to remember it, something to retrieve it. So he gives some examples of ways to make knowledge stick, and this could be really useful for older children too if they're going into exams.
And I think if we all think critically on some of those exams that we might have crammed for the night before, if we've done them as part of schooling or university, we probably can definitely say hand on heart we haven't retained a lot of that information, even though the day of the exam we probably had all of it fresh in our mind. So yes, that intense sort of cramming sort of model is not conducive to long-term retention because of the forgetting curve, but also because there isn't enough time to actively engage in retrieval practice between sessions. So being able to actually see if you remember, by doing things like flashcards or brain dumps or, short activities where you're basically testing your knowledge. So when you go in those test conditions, being tested actually can strengthen your memory because you're forcing yourself to make connections that otherwise might be trimmed away. But just doing lots of practice tests the day before is going to be too intense a strategy. The other thing that people need to think about for their children if they're studying for exams is ideally you're not just reading over notes. When we read over our notes and sort of look through things that we've learned before, or even reading key ideas or readings or watching videos, for example, we aren't actually engaging in any form of retrieval. We're just sort of recognizing things that we've seen. And it feels good. Like it feels like your child might say, oh yeah, I understand this. I remember this. So that recognition feels good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any retrieval is happening, and also doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. So in experiments where there's been some initial learning, they separate the groups into those who are allowed to reread and those who are just asked to try and retrieve, so try and remember what they've been seen before without access to the material. The ones who've been asked to retrieve retain the learning for longer and make better connections. The ones who got to reread the material for longer had no greater benefit.
So that's from episode 7 with Nathaniel Swain, and he has lots of other tips in there for teachers and parents in supporting students to remember what they have learnt in school as well. The art of not having too much in working memory, so not too much stuff in the part of the brain that you have to fill to have it sit there because it's kind of new information, is something that we also talked about in relation to why handwriting is so important. That was a super popular episode, actually. If you haven't listened already, you might want to check that one out, because we talked about how when handwriting is automatic, so it's something you don't have to think about anymore. It's something you don't have to keep in your working memory. It's not new. It feels normal and automatic. It means that you can use your working memory storage to focus on ideas instead. So you have more room for creative thinking and be able to express that on paper. You get to focus on the content, basically, of writing rather than the mechanics of it. Here is Helen Walls with more on that.
The thing is that because working memory is so limited and is highly in demand during writing, more so than probably anything else we do. It's every time we write, we're writing something new. It's productive. We're thinking about our ideas, our words, the sentence, how we get it done on the page, how we read and check. We're thinking about punctuation. There's so much going on. So if a child is still struggling to form their letters, and perhaps they don't know where to start or which way to go, they don't know which way around the B goes versus the D. It's the letters aren't sitting on the line. They're looking babyish. The child is actually fully occupied. Working memory will be just fully occupied with the letter formation aspect. So children stay stuck then on this, sort of lower level skill in a way. I mean, I actually think handwriting is very fundamental and very deep, but that they're going to be so distracted with letter formation that they just simply will not be able to think about all the other important things, like the ideas that they wish to express. So this is why, it's the strongest predictor of writing success for 5-year-olds is being able to handwrite well. It's a stronger predictor even than spelling, amazingly.
So that was Helen Walls in episode 18. Lorraine Hammond also spoke about working memory and relating it to spelling, and she explains how reading and spelling need to be taught as different things. In other words, you can't just expect that because a child can read, it means they can spell. That I guess seems kind of obvious. There are probably many people who can read and would say that their spelling is not the best. So here's what Lorraine says.
Over time, as children move their way through primary school, they encounter, as they get older and they read, if you like, different levels of words, the more complex nature of the English language. So it is a polyglot, which means that it's a combination of lots of languages. We've also got strange rules, like English words don't end in V. That's why we have an E on the end of love. You know, you might have thought it was something to do with the E talking to the O and saying its name, if you know that spelling rule.
Yes, but then it would be
I love
loaf.
you, which would be wrong. Okay, that would be wrong.
Yes.
So there are lots of little rules along the way. And I think as a parent, I'm always mindful of putting too much on parents and saying that what would be best is to be encouraging and look for evidence of, does it sort of make sense? Have they had a go at writing something down based on what they can hear? Because that is a very good indicator that things are, that a fundamental skill called phoneme segmentation is there.
Right.
Research on the ability to hear sounds and isolate them in words tells us that if you can't do that, you're going to have trouble with both reading and spelling. So not only is it correlational, it's causal, which means if you're not good at it, there's going to be a problem down the track. So that's one of the first signs to actually look for.
Now, I don't like to play favourites because there has been so many, and genuinely I can't pick a best episode from the season. But one I did really like for how accessible it is in terms of understanding how the brain learns to read is with Carolyn Strom. She has a wonderful way of explaining the different parts of the brain that are needed for fluency and comprehension in reading, so for understanding. She calls the different parts of the brain sound city, vision villages, and meaning mountains. And I think the best way to listen to that episode is actually to watch it on YouTube, because it has a graphic there that really helps you understand those three areas of the brain when you're hearing her talk about it. So visit youtube.com and then search for School Shorts NZ if you're interested in that. Because one of the most important things that Carolyn talks about is that our brains are not wired to read like we're just wired to naturally pick up spoken language. When we're babies or children, you talk to your children and eventually they kind of pick up those words and can say them back and use them in appropriate contexts. But reading is something different. It actually needs to be taught, not caught. So while we have spoken about the importance of reading to our kids in this episode, that alone is great for building vocabulary, but children also need to have the skills to decode sounds and symbols, because, as Carolyn says, words are actually just a series of squiggles, lines, and dots. You have to understand what those squiggles, lines, and dots what their sound is, and then not just knowing what their sound is, but knowing the link between that sound and the meaning. So here is Carolyn Strom way back in episode 2.
This is what's known as like the universal signature of the reading brain, right? We have people who can read have activity, right, in what's called the letterbox, the area of our brain that responds instantly to words and produces, activates pronunciation and meaning. Readers have that, and then people who have never learned to read do not have this specialized area. Right, this specialized area of our brain that responds to written words. No one is born with the mechanism allowing us to read, right? So we all have to build that, and it's actually we're retraining our brains to see these letters or squiggles, lines, and dots, and instantly connect them to spoken language, right? We're rewiring our brain for this new cultural invention.
Pam Snow actually explains that quite well, I think, by saying that, you don't learn to play the piano by listening to Mozart, unfortunately. How good would that be? But Pam also says, it's the role of teachers to understand the mechanics of learning to read, and a family's job to foster a love of books and language at home. And that's really, I guess, does align with, what is happening with teachers at the moment. They are doing so much professional development where they're going out into courses and learning about the structured literacy and how to teach that, the mechanics of learning to read. And so for a family, from a family's point of view, it's actually about supporting what is happening in the classroom. This is what Pam Snow says.
There's been a discourse, I think, in some education circles that it's really on parents to teach children how to read, that this is something that should be happening in the home environment in the same way that between birth and school entry, children acquire oral language predominantly in the home environment and then in daycare settings and preschool contexts and so forth through immersive experiences. And I think that reflects a fundamental misconception about the distinction between oral language as something that's biologically primary. So it is largely going to develop through those immersive everyday experiences because we humans have an evolutionary advantage for oral language. It's not completely set and forget, but we do have an advantage for it. And there's been a tendency in education circles to want to conflate reading with that process and treat it the same way. And then that moves us into an unfortunate space of parent blame when children do struggle. We hear education academics, unfortunately, sometimes say things like, well, if parents just read to their children more, and some famous children's authors unfortunately say things like this too, if parents just read to their children more, then literacy problems would somehow magically vanish. And there's absolutely no substance to that. We want parents to read to their children if they can. We need to recognise that not all parents are themselves capable readers. Not all parents are literate. But of course, we want parents to do what they can in the home environment, ideally from birth, in exposing children to books, to the beautiful vocabulary and the background knowledge and the complex sentence structure, and to the experience, the lovely parent-child experience of sharing book time together. But we mustn't kid ourselves that that's the same as teaching children to read. It's not teaching children how speech and print map to each other.
Pam is very respected in the structured literacy circles, and she has a newsletter called The Snow Report, which is a really interesting read if you are interested in more on the science of reading and learning. The person I interviewed, though, who has perhaps been the most influential in education reform in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is perhaps Professor James Chapman, and that is in episode 5, if you want to hear more about why he had been advocating for change. While this transition is going on, and actually, still in the very early stages, early results look promising in terms of achievement and data. Schools are reporting that fewer children are needing intervention. That's extra support. Teachers have reported improvements in student engagement and learning outcomes. There was the results of the 20 weeks phonics check from schools, which seems to show an improvement. However, there hasn't been a lot of data previously. So it is going to take some time to see the full impact and to actually have anything meaningful to compare it to, which is why I would say it is so key that there is a broader understanding about what is actually happening with all these changes at the moment, because inevitably with anything, with any change, there will be challenges to iron out, and no one wants their kid to be one of the casualties of the challenges of change. So if you've made it this far, thank you again. I hope some of those tips help to direct you to any of the episodes that you think might help your personal situation. And I just want to thank you for joining me. It's been a labour of love, this podcast this year, and if I'm honest, way more work than I expected. But I've also had a lot more feedback than I expected about how useful it has been, and people who have been quite grateful for discussions that they felt perhaps hasn't been so canvassed before. So I really appreciate that feedback, and please do always feel free to get in touch. I love hearing your thoughts, whether you are agreeing or disagreeing with any of the people that I am interviewing. Please do help me spread School Shorts far and wide. If you are interested in and how you can support me. If you can reshare, repost, review, subscribe, any of those things, I would be so grateful. And I hope you are well, wherever you are listening. Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.